Bryce's famous words, almost is not a story. There are many times this week where I almost didn't come up here. Too early, I've been sick all weekend. His voice rattled in my head. That almost is not a story. So here I am. Some of you know me. I am the husband to Mrs. Hill, 4th grade teacher, father to Bryce and Emma, and also a teacher at Battle Elementary. I've taught for over 24 years, thousands of lessons, but no lesson that I've ever taught is more important than the lesson that I'm going to teach today. Now I know we're having some technical issues, so we may have to slide things around a little bit. We may have to come back to my open. Oh, it's up. Good news. All right, we're going to start here with this image. It says, what do you see? Quickly tell your neighbor, what do you see in the image? Okay, if you see an old woman, please stand. If you see a young woman, stay seated. Okay, I see a mix. Okay, the correct answer is it's both. It's an optical illusion. It's a very famous optical illusion. If we do the next slide, it will help you to see. Go one more. Here is the young woman. So those of you who saw the young woman, if you see that arrow points to where her ear would be, her chin in the middle, and that would be her necklace, the black line down there. And so that's, if you saw the young woman, actually research has shown that the younger you are, the more likely you are to see the young woman. But the old woman is also there. Go ahead and do the next slide. Now it may take your brain a minute to adjust. Her eyes, there's one hidden on the backside, her other one's straight across from it. The old woman is looking down. Her nose is pointed down. And what you saw as a necklace in the first image is actually her mouth. And so, depending on how you look at this picture, you might have a different view of who you see here. Can we look at the same image and see a different view? Can we each see the same person and see them in a different way? Do people view you differently? Does God view you differently? Go ahead and do our next slide. So now that you know, can you see fully? Do you fully know this image? What if I told you there's a third person in there? There's not. But what if I told you there was, right? It would freak you out. Go ahead and do the next slide. Well, I've had this kind of experience with Bryce. Many of you know this famous champion oak tree. Bryce and I spent many hours out there taking pictures, arriving in the early hours. They claim that this tree is about 300 to 400 years old. It's about 295 inches around, 74 feet tall. And so we have visited it over and over, and it's never looked the same way twice. Why? Seasons change, light changes, clouds change, even people around it change. We don't have time for this story, but Bryce and I have a story about the two of us out there, girls in a prom dress, and a biker gang. And somehow it turned out with Bryce and I organizing a picture at the big tree. So it can change based on very different situations. And so many times we'd get up and wait for the light to change. Light changed our views of things, the way we saw them. I see that big tree very differently than you do, because I've been out there hundreds of times. Many different situations, I see it in a different way. God also sees it in a different way. He saw that tree when it was just a sprout coming out of the ground. And he also saw that tree 300 to 400 years later when Bryce and I stood next to it. He saw its full existence. Now, even if you and I stood at that tree for the full 300 to 400 years, we still wouldn't see it fully. Because there's a whole other part, the roots underneath, that has allowed it to survive through the struggles and the pain. You don't see it, but God does. God sees through time what is seen and what is unseen. We see in part God sees fully. Go ahead and do our next slide. This is our verse for today. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Go ahead to our next slide. We know Bryce loved adventures. He'd always say, Dad, can we go on an adventure? It was always about the unknown becoming known. This is a picture of Mount Konocti. It is in our hometown in California. And last summer, Bryce had this on his to-do list. We had done it earlier, but he wanted to do it one more time because he knew he'd be attending State Tech and wasn't sure if he'd have the opportunity again. And so, it's about a 6-mile round-trip hike. You climb 1,600 feet in elevation. When you're living in the Midwest, that takes a lot of air going up as you change because you're not used to climbing. So on that climb, we discuss life, problems, issues, relationships, and the future. I even know one of you sent him a text while we were on that climb. And he laughed because he said he doesn't always get to respond this way. Not right now, I'm climbing a volcano. And so, as we marched, we talked about how life is like that hike up a volcano. It's a struggle. It's steep. It's hard. Some parts of that climb, when you're climbing up a volcano, you can't see the majestic views. You're blocked by trees. You can't see things. Every once in a while, we'd get a glimpse of how beautiful it was. We finally reached the top. We reached the peak. And of course, Bryce, in all his excitement, can we just stay here forever? He thought this was the greatest thing. There's rocks everywhere for him to climb, huge boulders. He's all the way out there. His words, Dad, come on. You know, and I'm slowly, the old guy, following behind, trying to keep up with him as he's climbing all these rocks. And so he wanted to stay. He wanted to enjoy the moment. But I believe that Bryce has reached his peak. He can fully see now. His struggles were worth it. While we were on the peak, Bryce called for me to climb out, and he was out on these huge, massive rocks. And so it took me some time, but I got out there because I was trying to take pictures of it. And so when we got there, I'm climbing out on these big rocks, and I'm turning to take a picture, and my eye noticed something on the ground. There was a small rock stuck between these boulders, and I pulled out this rock that's with me today. Go ahead with the next slide. This is the rock I found. On one side, a big tree. On the other side, Mount Konocti. Bryce and I stood in awe. We could not believe we had traveled 2,000 miles, climbed over 1,000 feet in elevation, and on that day and that time, this rock was placed right at my foot. At the time, I told Bryce I would remember our journey by keeping that rock. And I'd stuffed it in my pocket. Some of you might say it's a coincidence. I don't think so. I think God knew on that day, at that time, we would need that rock as a reminder. Now that rock symbolizes something else. For me now, I look at it. I see those roots on that tree, grounded on earth. I see the big tree and its struggles. But there's a flip side. What I referred to Bryce as heaven when you reach the peak. That I can not only look on one side of the rock and see the struggles, but I can flip it over. And I know that even in the darkest moments, God's going to give us views. He's going to allow us to see what that peak looks like. I told Bryce I would keep that rock, and I will. Our next slide. There's Bryce on that rock area. Bryce loved Billy Graham. You would never know that he loved him. I would play Billy Graham YouTube videos, and Bryce would sit and say, I love how he tells a story. And so I thought I would have to include a Billy Graham verse that fit in here very well, his saying. It says, mountaintops are for views and inspiration, but fruit is grown in the valleys. This is our journey. You're going to have mountaintop moments. You're going to be in the valleys. Right now, our family's in a valley. But we're looking to the mountaintop. We're looking ahead to a time where we will reunite with him. Go ahead to the next slide. Shortly before Bryce's crash, I had sat down with him because he had struggled. What his friends were saying about him. Who he wanted to be. What would his legacy be? We all do that, especially as teenagers, trying to figure out who you are. So as his dad, I sat him down, and we went through the song that is titled, Who You Say I Am. Now Bryce would tell you, still today, it took way too much time, Dad. He had adventures to do. But I made him sit, and I made him go line by line through that song. We looked at Bible verses that went with each line of the song. And so, in Bryce's well-known chicken scratch writing, he would write down, left-handed, what he thought about each verse, and we have that notebook still of his writing. Now, I didn't bring the whole notebook for you today, but I did bring you a few things that he wrote down, because I think they're important for our message today. So we'll go ahead with the first slide. In Psalms it says, For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Bryce wrote down, he knew what would happen even before I was born. Next slide. In Jeremiah it says, For I know that the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Bryce wrote down, God knows all the plans he has for me. I have a future and a hope. Next one. In Romans it says, And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. Bryce wrote down, all things have a purpose, and all things work together for God. Next one. In Romans, it says, No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. Bryce wrote down, God will never stop loving us. I loved how he wrote us. It's not just him. It's all of you. Okay, next one. This was a note that he wrote down. He said, God's opinion matters more than the opinion of man. Men's opinions are just that. They're just opinions. They're not reality. But God's opinion of you is reality. In this next part, I'm going to need a little crowd participation. We all know one of Bryce's favorite words is indeed. So I had to find a way to get this as part of the speech. So I'm going to say something that the Bible says about you and how God views you. Your response, I will say indeed, and I want you guys to respond. Indeed. All right, let's see. Nice. It was very Bryce-like tone in the front row. Okay, here we go. You are a child of God. Indeed.
Indeed.
He has plans for you. Indeed.
Indeed.
He has a place for you. Indeed.
Indeed.
He knows you fully. Indeed.
Indeed.
He loves you. Indeed.
Indeed.
Okay, next slide. So that is our verse. Again, God knows you fully. He loves you fully. Right now, we can't see things clearly, especially when bad things happen. You have to look through the lens of faith, hope, and love. Next slide. Yesterday I added this slide because as I was just reviewing, getting ready for today, the same verse was found in the Message, and I had taken this picture of Bryce out by the big tree, and I absolutely love this picture because it has a whole new meaning to me now. But now it says, we don't yet see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. But it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then. See it all as clearly as God sees us. Knowing him directly just as he knows us. Next slide. So again, in review, there's 3 things I want you to come away with today. Number 1, we see in part and God sees fully. Whether you see the picture of the old woman or young woman, you're seeing and viewing that person in a different way. You don't know the person next to you fully. You see part. We saw part of Bryce. You saw part of Bryce. God saw Bryce fully and loved him. Number 2, what God says about you is more important than what others might say. Again, their opinions don't change reality. God's opinion is reality. And finally, the 3rd thing is these 3 things remain: faith, hope, and love. At Bryce's memorial service, Mr. Clemens spoke and did a wonderful job. And he stood up there and wondered what Bryce would say to you now that he sees things fully. Well, I think I found part of that answer in a video clip I found of Bryce when he had reached the peak of Mount Konocti. I want you to listen closely to the words that he says, because I think when he reached heaven, he might have similar words. So let's go ahead and see if that works on the video. Oh, it's not working. Well, that's not good. Okay. Well, I will just tell you what he said. I won't make you wait. Maybe I'll post it somewhere for you to see later on. But in the video, Bryce is stepping out on the rocks, and he's walking away. And as he's walking away, I'm asking him some questions about the journey up the hill, or up the mountain. And he responded to me. He said, the journey was hard, but it was 100% worth it in the end. I said, Bryce, would you do it again? Yes, indeed. Then he said, I'm going to go get my own spot. And he races off to find his spot. Now, again, knowing who you are in God is the most important thing. What your friends say, they know part of you. Even what your parents say about you, that's part of you. What your teachers say is part. But we want the whole thing. In a moment, I'd like us to end, if we have time. This is the song that I had Bryce write out. And I would like us to be able to sing it at the end. Hopefully the video works. When we stand and sing, I want you to think, if you haven't fully committed to God, you're just kind of part way there, I would like you to seek out a teacher or Mrs. Hill or myself, and we'd love to pray with you. Don't wait, because remember, almost is not a story.